On behalf of the PolicyLink team, really welcome you all to today's conversation, which is really focused on scaling strategies for advancing spatial justice and equitable development in across the country and Puerto Rico. As you all know, my name is Jerry Maldonado. I'm Vice President of PolicyLink, and I have the honor of working with this really powerful team of partners from across the U.S. and its territories to advance a stronger multiracial democracy as we work to build more equitable and inclusive communities of opportunity that work for all of us, especially the 100 million people living at 200% or below the poverty line. In this especially challenging moment that we're in, where we're facing really existential threats to both our democracy and our economy, as a result of runaway inequality and climate change, to me, it is incredibly special to hold and create spaces like this that allow us to imagine and build new models of governing, housing, and development that center the voice and dignity and wisdom of frontline communities who are most vulnerable to gentrification and climate-related displacement. So that end, we're really grateful at PolicyLink to support today's discussion as part of our evolving housing justice program and our Winning in Equity Places portfolio, which really focuses on advancing community-led strategies that reimagine how development happens and who benefits from that development across the US, the industrial heartland, California, and Puerto Rico. At PolicyLink, we believe that lasting national change happens from the ground up. And so this afternoon, we'll hear from some of our partners in Puerto Rico who are not just contesting how development happens in a post-disaster context, but also working to advance new models of community control and development. And as part of this work, we recognize that scaling these strategies requires new ways of partnering across the public, philanthropic, and community sector to more effectively mobilize our collective assets, our networks, and our capital in ways that help move and bend the arc of development towards justice. So we're really grateful to have you join us this afternoon on our call. Many of you are fellow travelers who've been alongside us in this journey, and we're looking forward to deepening our partnership and relationship with you all as we build this work ahead. And in that spirit, I want to go ahead and introduce my friend and colleague, Cristina Engel, the CEO at Magic Cabinet, one of PolicyLink's core philanthropic partners in our Winning in Equity in Puerto Rico portfolio, to offer some welcoming remarks. Cristina.
Thank you, Jerry. That was a friend and colleague as well. Very, very honored to hear that and to welcome that, or extend that to you as well. Thank you, everybody, and welcome. My name is Cristina Engel. I serve as the CEO over at Magic Cabinet. And for the past 15 years at Magic Cabinet, we've developed a participatory giving practice that establishes a longer, more flexible financial runway for community serving organizations. Perhaps even more importantly, this approach empowers local leaders to drive and evolve their work in a truly authentic local context. And at Magic Cabinet, our mission is to really champion communities' work, not necessarily the mission or vision or theory of change that we have inside of our own team, but really uplifting the work that's happening on the ground with the folks that are most aligned and in tune and equipped to handle some of our most pressing challenges. This work is in partnership with nonprofits and philanthropists. We really want to achieve a deeper local impact. To do this, we're advocating for the broader adoption of collaborative philanthropic practice as it's central to the work in order to help build a stronger safety net. For Magic Cabinet, our partnership with PolicyLink represents our first significant collaborative philanthropic effort. And together with PolicyLink, we've dedicated $3 million in multi-year funding to support community-led and defined initiatives inside of Puerto Rico. By working in partnership and aligning resource partners, we aim to catalyze systematic changes that represent and uplift the unique context of Puerto Rico, the nonprofits, and the communities. Our vision is a future where community-led initiatives drive impactful change and creating a more resilient and equitable Puerto Rico. Deepak.
Yes. So Deepak, let's invite you to join us. I just want to say a few words about Deepak. Deepak Lambanieres joined PolicyLink earlier this year as the inaugural director for our infrastructure justice portfolio. Deepak is based in San Juan, and in that role, he's also leading our Winning in Equity in Places portfolio in Puerto Rico, in deep partnership with many of the folks who are on this call. So Deepak, I'll kick it to you.
Thank you so much, Jerry and Christina, for the introduction. I'm very happy to co-host this webinar and to moderate what I'm sure will be a very engaging and informative conversation on our housing futures. In the next couple of minutes, I want to do several things. First, let me explain how the rest of the activity is organized. We will have 3 sets of presentations, followed by a reaction, and we'll finalize with a question and answer session. We kindly ask the attendees to hold off on asking substantive questions until the Q&A. And please stay on mute to ensure that the speakers are able to present without unwanted interruptions. You can also drop questions in the chat, and Axel will make sure that we capture them and get to them in the Q&A. Secondly, let me briefly introduce our panelists. We will drop a link in the chat to a document that includes their full bios, so you can learn more about them. But in the interest of time, I will only provide their names, positions, and affiliations. So today, I'm very happy to be joined by Rashida Phillips, Director of Housing at PolicyLink, Trom Huang, Senior Housing Associate at PolicyLink, Cristina Miranda Palacios, Executive Director, La Liga de Ciudades de Puerto Rico, Luis Gallardo, the Executive Director of Centro para la Reconstrucción del Hábitat, and Tony Pickett, Chief Executive Officer of Grounded Solutions Network. And just finally, before we dive into the presentations, let me provide a bit of background and context. Our main goal today is to discuss the critical need for a reparative national spatial justice framework as a North Star for more equitable, inclusive housing future across the United States and its territories, and showcase some truly innovative solutions. So let me highlight the larger puzzle, and I want to thank Trom for providing me with some of this critical data. Next slide, please. So across the United States, more than half of renters are spending over 30% of their incomes just to keep a roof over their heads. This burden falls especially heavily on communities of color. Black renters are far more likely to be cost burdened, struggling with rent that eats up a significant chunk of their income. The situation becomes even more alarming when considering evictions, which disproportionately target Black women. Despite these stark realities, the housing market isn't producing enough units that people can actually afford. Next slide. Now, the US housing market seems more focused on profit than people. While new construction has reached record highs in recent years, it's not addressing the needs of those who most need it. We're seeing expensive market rate homes go up, but there is a critical shortage of affordable options, especially for those earning less than 80% of the area median income. Now, this shortage is most pronounced for extremely low-income individuals and families. In essence, the current system is producing homes for investors, not for the people who truly need them. Next slide. Now, this trend is further fueled by a shift in ownership patterns. Smaller buildings are more likely to be owned by individuals, which means homeowners, owner-occupying landlords, or single landlords. However, as we move towards larger apartment buildings, ownership becomes concentrated in entities that are harder to track, such as LLCs or real estate investment trusts or REITs. This is a worrisome trend since it underscores how difficult it is to keep our homes in the hands of owners who are invested in our communities. Next slide. The situation in Puerto Rico is even more complex since a series of natural disasters have slammed Puerto Rico, leaving its housing sector in ruins. Over 725,000 households, representing nearly 60% of occupied housing units, reported damages from hurricanes Irma and Maria. However, these storms merely expose some deeper issues that have plagued the island's housing for years. Land tenure and titling issues are common, partly due to a long-standing shortage of affordable housing for a significant portion of the population. Construction has focused on specific segments, neglecting the need for social housing. And this has resulted in a surplus of vacant units, a worsening affordability crises, and lengthy wait lists for publicly supported housing programs. Furthermore, a significant number of homes were built in flood zones, lacking proper insurance, and did not meet building codes, which left hundreds of thousands of families extremely vulnerable, even before the hurricanes hit. Next slide, please. Furthermore, due to misguided policies that failed to produce sufficient housing, welcomed U.S. investors to speculate with our housing stock, and allowed short-term rentals to mushroom throughout the island, we're facing significant housing price increases and a growing affordability crisis. Please keep in mind that 43% of the population in the island is under the poverty line, and that median household income is somewhere around $24,000, which pales in comparison to that of the United States, which is close to $75,000. So with that context in mind, let me just quickly turn it over to our first set of panelists, Rashida and Tram. And to get us started, I have a question for you both, which is, PolicyLink's housing team has been advancing a powerful vision and a strategy for rethinking land and housing justice in the United States. Can you share with us your thoughts on what you mean by reparative spatial futures? And also, what kinds of transformations are you hoping to advance in, for example, how we understand and reorient ourselves towards ownership? You have 12 minutes and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks for having us. My name is Rashida Phillips. I am Director of Housing at PolicyLink. I want to apologize. I'm going to have to hop off shortly after I present. I'm at a conference in Washington, D.C. right now talking about affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is a really important topic right now. So, and absolutely relates to what we'll be talking about. But yeah, so just to tell you all a little bit about the Spatial Futures Initiative and how we're sort of orienting ourselves to housing and to land justice. The Spatial Futures Initiative is really centered on a comprehensive narrative strategy that allows us to think about how we address historical inequities in land and housing through policy and through cultural efforts. And so our initiative is aiming to unify diverse efforts into a cohesive movement for land and housing justice that is going to directly confront systemic inequities such as Indigenous land dispossession, urban redlining, all of the things that have dispossessed Black and Brown and Indigenous people from land and from housing throughout time. And so by employing sort of a multifaceted narrative approach, as well as policy and strategy approach, our initiative illuminates these systemic inequities, generates transformative policy recommendations, and amplifies our interventions for justice. Next slide, please. And so through this initiative, we have developed an approach to reparative spatial justice. And we define that as a transformative approach that rectifies historical and ongoing injustices in the allocation and use of space, housing, and land. It's aimed at reconfiguring spaces where historically marginalized communities can reclaim their connection to land and gain restitution for enduring racist policies and practices. Our approach and framework around reparative spatial justice includes aspirational world building. It seeks to be transformative rather than reformist, and it is community-driven and place-based. Next slide, please. And so this vision, right, there's the vision and then there's the practice. And what that includes and what that means, right, is that we're reckoning, repairing, and transforming. That means dismantling current systems, creating new models for housing and land justice. This involves invoking spatial and temporal imaginaries, so drawing on Black, Indigenous, and Brown perspectives, ways of being in the world to envision and build new spaces and futures. Understanding that, right, we have the answers. We, in our Indigenous and ancestral practices, we understand how to deal with things like climate change and how to deal with the land and the ways that the land changes and the relationships with land. So bringing those ways back into how we build space and how we think about housing and land justice. And then reimagining collaboration, innovating ways to collaborate with the communities who are most impacted. Again, the communities who have the answers, but don't have the resources to build sustainable power. And then co-developing housing solutions. So creating equitable housing futures beyond just crisis response models. Allowing time for communities to plan and live out their futures. So much of housing, so I come from a background where I was a previous housing attorney and representing people who were facing eviction and loss of their homes. And so much of our ways of our strategies are built on a crisis response, are built on a situation where someone is going through something and we don't have time to really build out a sustainable way of addressing the solutions and addressing the issues that they're dealing with. And so we have to change from these crisis response models and build out our sustainable futures and give communities that time and space to plan, so that they're not just going from crisis to crisis and unable to really think about what is needed to sustain their communities. Next slide, please. And then this includes, when we're talking about policy, this includes decentralizing fiscal asset accumulation and closing the wealth gap at the foremost goal of housing policy. So again, often when we're talking about housing policy, what we're hearing is that, right, it's all about closing the racial wealth gap, which is really important, right? But reassessing how we think about that, maybe switching to a recognition of communal wealth, recognition of wealth beyond fiscal accumulation, seeing wealth as, you know, community assets and what the community has and the community's health in general. And also thinking about models that emphasize intergenerational health, intergenerational joy, intergenerational happiness and sustainability versus just intergenerational wealth. Again, that is also important, but should not be the foremost way that we're addressing housing policy in our country. And then decommodifying housing and centering it instead as a platform, again, of personal, familial, and communal health, not just wealth building. Next slide, please. And so just a few examples of what that looks like in practice. The organizations that I have listed there, this is definitely non-exhaustive. There's many different organizations and projects and initiatives out there that are taking these sorts of approaches around reparative spatial justice and housing futures, and looking at different ways of doing community ownership, of cultural preservation and advocacy. So Africatown Community Land Trust, it's a project in Seattle that secures land to prevent displacement and develops affordable housing in Seattle's Central District. We have Destination Crenshaw, which celebrates Black culture in South Los Angeles, supporting Black-owned businesses and inclusive development as well as housing. Oak CLT in Oakland promotes community ownership and equitable development to combat displacement. We have Moms for Housing, also in the Bay, which advocates for housing as a human right in Oakland, pushing for policy changes and empowering unhoused families and occupying homes and getting those homes put into the community's own hands. And then we have Art Place CLT, which is based in St. Louis. It uses art to engage the community in housing issues, and created a CLT that is based on, that is for artists who are from that community who have been displaced by lack of affordable housing. So I'll pass it to Trom now to talk about different approaches to community ownership.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Trom. So very broadly, our team sees the reimagination of ownership in this country as both a defensive and an offensive strategy. So as Deepak alluded to in the slides, for the last few years, we have been experiencing a massive shift in our housing system. And that's one in which housing ownership is increasingly concentrated in the hands of private equity companies, which research shows that when a multifamily home or even single family home is owned by a private equity firm, they are more likely to evict and displace tenants. Tenant outcomes are much poorer when they are the owners. And this is risky because private equity now represents over half of the financial backing among the 35 largest owners of multifamily buildings. And this problem has gotten even worse with the foreclosure crisis and the climate crisis, opening the door to disaster capitalism that targets people who are more likely to face discriminatory barriers in homeownership and their ability to stay housed. So this financialization of housing is something that we can actively combat by removing land from the speculative market and ensuring that it's protected from extractive forces. And in doing so, we are building something new. This is something that Rashida alluded to. We're creating models of housing that shift the way people define and value wealth, building community assets, and also creating collective care systems so that people see housing not just as how they've experienced it, which is maybe a tool for exclusion and displacement, but rather a tool for achieving solidarity and prosperity. And there are a few different mechanisms that we can use to do that, which I'll touch on very briefly because I know that Luis and Christina will talk about what they look like in practice. So the first I want to mention is land disposition policies. That's a really good way to prioritize publicly owned or government-owned land for community development that benefits the public good, rather than selling it off to the highest bidder to fill budget gaps, which is very commonly a short-term political strategy and not so much a long-term community development strategy. And California is a great example of that. They have a Surplus Land Act to prioritize publicly owned land for affordable housing development. Land banks are also an incredibly important tool to acquire vacant, abandoned, or deteriorated properties and, quote, clean them up through doing things like clearing titles and getting rid of liens, other things that need to happen before the parcel of land can be put to good use, whether that is for affordable housing or other community assets. And then community land trusts are also something you've likely heard of, but the model separates the parcel of land from the improvement on the land or the home, right? And that makes it so the cost of the home is more attainable. And community land trusts come with a resale formula. So that means that when a homeowner sells their home, a part of the equity that they have gained in ownership is reinvested back into the home to keep it affordable for the next owner. And then the last thing I want to mention, I mean, there's so many tools, but the last thing I'll mention due to time is Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act policies, or TOPA, they're commonly referred to as, which requires landlords to provide an advance notice of sale to tenants. And then it gives tenants an opportunity to, if they choose, form a tenant association, express their interest in buying the unit, and oftentimes buying the unit or buying the building so that they can transition from being tenants to owning their home. And we'll go to the next slide. So we know what the policy tools are, but too often I hear people say, well, my city already has that policy. Isn't the problem solved? Or, sure, we have a land trust, but it doesn't move fast enough to compete with the market. And my response to that is somewhat an unconventional one. I ask people to think about the most traditional form of ownership in this country, which is single-family home ownership, and reflect on how easy it is for so many people, right? Of course, it comes with its flaws and the discrimination in the mortgage system, but also in general, right? We have a pretty straightforward system of home ownership. And why do we think of it as the most, quote, traditional form of ownership? So reflecting on my own story, when I was a renter and was lucky enough to be in a position to buy a home, I was very nervous about the process. But, as one does, you meet with a realtor, and then it felt like I was on a lazy river to home ownership. There are realtors, there are lenders, there are title officers, there are escrow officers, like every piece is in place to guide you towards owning your home. So that's the image on the right? And once we found the house we wanted, it took mere weeks. And at the same time, I have been following an effort that my neighbors in Minneapolis at Inquilinos Unidos are going through to purchase their building from their slumlord, whose rental license was already revoked by the city of Minneapolis. And it was years in the making and is still in the process. So compared to my lazy river of homeownership, their journey to homeownership of collective community ownership was like whitewater rafting upstream. So that's the image on the left. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is not, why is it so hard for tenants or nonprofits to figure out how to acquire property, but rather, why haven't we invested the resources in building an infrastructure for tenant or community ownership that compares to the machine we have created for home ownership? And equally important is the question of, why do we see the failure to increase home ownership as a public policy issue, but the inability to increase community ownership as a tenant or a land trust issue? So I think that collectively we have to invest capacity and, most importantly, money into these solutions so that we can level the playing field for them to actually be effective, compete in a market that isn't designed for them to thrive in, and scale up to deliver meaningful impact and results. So that is all I have at the time, and I'll kick it back to Deepak.
Thank you so much, Rashida and Tram, for giving us that amazing presentation and all the work that you're doing in the housing portfolio at PolicyLink. I want to turn now to Cristina Miranda Palacios. And Cristina, you and the wonderful team at La Liga de Ciudades have been advancing a new vision for basically how we understand governance, and you all have been also devising new collaborative governance models at the municipal scale in Puerto Rico. How do you think these approaches can actually help us better address critical issues in the housing sector and advance new housing futures? You have 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Deepak. I'm super excited to be here and super pumped. I'm gonna go like this so that, yes. So just a brief intro about La Liga, because I think it's important for you guys to understand our approach. We are a political organization that promotes a municipalist agenda. And when we say that we're a political organization, it's because we know and we believe that in order to change the system, you have to insert yourself in the different areas of power. So we do a lot of research, advocacy, and execution of projects and programs that I'm gonna share some now. We do base our work on 7 thematic axes that are very present in how we experience life, which is more close to our municipality or our community. So all of our thematic axes are very political ones, and they go, for example, from education from early childhood to the elderly. So it's not the usual way of seeing education, K-12. In the same sense, we work towards climate justice, not the environment. So we work around these 7 thematic axes, and with the recognition that we do indeed have to advance that new vision that you're asking about to really redefine how we understand government, but also and governance, but also to devise new governance models at the municipal scale in Puerto Rico. And that's what we've been trying to do. And there are a couple of things that we know. The first one, and we always like to say it, is that the system in Puerto Rico, as in elsewhere, is not broken. The system truly works to perfection because it really works on behalf of those that design it, that uphold us, and that are the ones that are continuously feeding us the message that we have to focus on resilience. For La Liga, the solution is truly systemic change, and the way that we've been working on that, it got stuck. It's first by understanding that when we talk about, I don't know if somebody can change it, but to understand that when we talk about a municipality, we are really referring to a geographic area. We're not only referring to the unit of local government that is a key part of that geographic area. So the way we see municipalism, which is our agenda, is really as an action method that we can use to achieve systemic change from the municipal ecosystem. And the way that we define our municipal ecosystem is in the sense that, yes, the unit of local government is a key member of that ecosystem, but it's not the only component of that ecosystem. So when we talk about a municipality, we're talking about the unit of local government, the community leaders, yes, but also the community residents, the nonprofit organizations, corporations, academia, and all with a focus on content experts that can either provide cultural competence and cultural humility. Next. And the way that we see this new governance and the way that we define our municipalist agenda, it's focusing on 2 main things, right? First, we need to strengthen the units of local government while connecting municipal ecosystems. And that's why I'm really excited about the conversation, because I think that the collaboration that La Liga and CRH have been able to establish really shows the power of that collective. You cannot do one without the other. So we do need to strengthen our units of local government. Tram was talking about building capacity. That applies to the unit of local government, but it also applies with our municipal ecosystems. Next. The way that we have launched a proposal to really address this reality is by launching a municipal innovation lab that is focusing on elevating and promoting our units of local government as models of good practices in order for them to strengthen their capacity and their resources in the benefit of the community. So it's not building capacity for capacity's sake, but it's building capacity for transformation. Next. And the lab, what we wanted to do in order to really try it was that we needed to identify a cohort of mayors and municipalities that would be willing to join us in a journey for innovation. And we were really intentional in not including municipalities for the metropolitan area because even though, because their reality is different, it's dire, it's more dire than the realities than a lot of the communities in the US, but it's better off in a bit than the other municipalities in Puerto Rico outside the metropolitan area. So we wanted a cohort of 5 municipalities. It's a long journey, but we're only going to focus on 3 of the stops, which are the ones that we're elevating in the conversation. If somebody can hit next. And the focus that we want to give on this conversation, it's our 3 primary steps to change how governance and to change the way it's seen. The first one is the municipal assessment. The second step would be the development of a municipal innovation plan. And the third one is La Constructora, which is a co-creation strategy for the municipal assessment. Next, what we decided to do was that we needed to really have a tool that would allow us to give a deep dive and a deep look into how the units of local government in Puerto Rico are run and are managed, but not from an accounting or finance perspective, but from an equity lens. We needed to make sure first that we had standards for good municipal governance that were anchored in equity. So that's why we, with support from PolicyLink and with our partners at HRNA, we designed this really neat tool that highlights what these 10 standards for good governance are. And they go from community engagement to investment government services, and the last one, which is my favorite, protects and advocates for the municipality. So that would be putting municipality over party and over everything else. Next, with the findings of the assessments, one of the things that we're doing is that, and with this, we interview key informants, we interview the mayors, we are interviewing directors, but we're also interviewing, all types of levels at the unit of local government. And we're also doing the reviews. And the idea is that once we complete the assessment, we can highlight and we can identify in which of the indicators they're either emergent, established, or systematic, so that we can either strengthen those indicators or we can elevate them and put them as models. So with the assessment findings, we're going to create an innovation plan that will highlight 2 indicators up to strengthen, and then 1 indicator to elevate. Next. And then the last phase of our co-governance project is called La Constructora. It's a really neat methodology that we have developed. It's a 9 steps of co-design and co-creation that's divided in 3 main steps. Phase 1, I have my watch here. Phase 1, which is to clarify. Phase 2, which is the co-creation of solutions. And phase 3, the constitution of funds and implementation. Next, on the way that it would work is that if answering the question that Deepak had as to whether or not they would really help us address critical issues in the housing sector. And the response is yes, indeed. They do, and they will. And I think that the collaboration next that we have been able to establish with CDH, that has been partners of La Liga since day 1, really elevate that. Because at the same time that the CDH has been elevating and working on strengthening their capacity, their organizational capacity, we have been doing the same thing with the hopes that we can both inform, elevate, and ignite our collective agendas. Next. In the case of the CDH, the way that we see them as partners is that they are our contact experts for everything related to blight, to housing. So for us, they are the ones that have to be with us in the ecosystem table with that municipal ecosystem so that we can really elevate the work that needs to be done. Next. We have also launched a really neat tool. It's available on our website. It's called the Federal Funding Navigator. And with the minute and a half that I have left, I will explain what it means. And what the tool does is that it has a curated list of all the federal funding opportunities that are open right now, or that have been, or that are projected to be open, focused, and that are applicable to Puerto Rico from IIJA and IRA. And this tool is important because what it does is it saves about 8 months and a half to municipal staffers, but also nonprofit and academia and all partners out there. Next, because it really highlights the funding opportunities that are available, but it allows you to have a searchable engine in which you compare your project with the funding opportunity. And once you have that match made, you can complete a readiness assessment that will let you know how ready or not ready you are to submit for that application. So this would be instrumental to achieve the goal that we work for, which is to increase the municipality's access to funds and greater equity. So the tools that we have been able to design really advance not only in the way of how we are having different kinds of conversations about what is governance, also redefining what is truly a municipalist agenda that is mayor informed, but that is not mayor centric, and that can only be achieved with a collective effort from partners and allies. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Cristina, for
I have
that.
10 seconds left, so right
That's
in
good.
time.
That's good. Thank you so much for being on time, and thank you for the work that you do. I want to turn now quickly to Luis. Luis, you're now up next, and I want to ask you a couple of heavy questions. So the Centro para la Reconstrucción del Hábitat, CRH, has proposed some highly imaginative and viable solutions to address Puerto Rico's housing crisis. Can you describe Puerto Rico's housing puzzle and how CRH is helping solve it? Also, CRH has championed the idea of municipal land banks. Can you explain how these land banks work and are helping advance alternative models of ownership? And can you also talk about the fund that your team developed to help fill some of the critical financing gaps that currently exist? I know this is a lot to cover, so you have 20 minutes and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Deepak. And yes, it's my pleasure to be here and to share the space with so many amazing people and so many familiar faces. We have a nice all-star team in the chat, and again, it's my honor to be here. We could jump to the next slide. I'll get right into it to address each and every one of the questions that Deepak mentioned. Just give you a little bit of overview for those of you who are not familiar with our organization, the Center for Center for Reconstruction of Habitat, or CRH in its Spanish acronym. We are a 501c3, and we're the only organization in Puerto Rico that's dedicated to addressing vacancy and abandonment and how to leverage and convert those blighted properties into assets for community development. We do that in a number of ways. Go to the next slide. But first, give you a little bit of a overview of Puerto Rico's vacancy and abandonment issue right now. It's a difficult number to pinpoint because it's not like there was a census of just abandoned properties. We kind of have to correlate different numbers that we find through different databases, such as the U.S. Census's vacancy rate. According to the U.S. Census, Puerto Rico has a 24% vacancy rate, according to the last American Community Survey. Again, that includes everything from second homes to properties that might be up for sale or for rent, and just simply the market hasn't taken care of those properties yet. But in addition to those 373,000 properties, the U.S. Census also counts 300,000 other vacant properties. Those could be properties that are in deteriorated state. They're not even available on the market, properties that are going through some sort of foreclosure process. And there's a whole string of other subcategories under that other vacant number. But what we do know is that the Puerto Rico vacancy rate is directly correlated to the concentration of blighted properties that can represent health and safety risks to communities. And the correlation between communities that were hard hit by Hurricanes Irma, Maria, and Fiona, as well as Afro-Puerto Rican communities and also elderly individuals, low-income families. There are so many correlations between the concentration of abandonment with vulnerable populations, and it definitely is an environmental justice issue. And we couple that with the number of abandoned schools, there are abandoned industry spaces, businesses, which there are no census data on that, which we just have to presume are also high. We could jump to the next slide. Which is ironic, and this is kind of where our organization's slogan comes into effect, that we don't want homes without people and people without homes. We highlight the contradiction that exists right now within our society, that we have abandoned homes, but we also have a need for housing. There is a housing crisis right now in Puerto Rico. There is about, according to recent studies that we've been able to pick out for the purpose of this report, it's about 40% less affordable housing than there was in 2020. That's the lowest rate in decade. CDBG-DR has to constantly increase their relocation vouchers. Right now, they're at $200,000. There's already talks of exceptions and other increases in order to try to improve displaced families' purchasing power. At the start of the year, there were 3,000 families with relocation vouchers. Only 900 of those have been able to relocate. And right now, the recent housing report that I found from Estudios Técnicos came out maybe about 2 or 3 months ago stated that housing construction for new construction has increased 28% in the last year. And you know, as Deepak and Tramak mentioned in the previous slides, this is something that we are seeing throughout the United States, but in Puerto Rico, we are seeing the highest vacancy rate in the US. There are communities where 2 out of every 3 properties fall within that vacancy census category. And we are having a housing crisis as well, despite the fact that there is money flowing around through recovery dollars and so on. We could jump to the next slide. We dove into these properties in a study that we published about 1.5 years ago with the National Hazards Center. We took a sample of about 900 properties from different code enforcement programs in Puerto Rico that we were working on, and we identified that there were a lot of tenure-related issues. We're talking about 71% of the properties appeared that they were registered in the tax system, but only 29% of them had up-to-date addresses. A lot of individuals were passed away, a lot of fractured title. We were seeing a lot of generational title issues, and a lot of the abandoned properties were falling within this category of title woes. We could jump to the next slide. But when we started looking at the actual physical condition of a lot of these properties, we took about half of those properties had completed the whole code enforcement process, where we were able to track down who the actual owners were. We were able to work with the owners to get repaired, and we were able to look at those properties that were not mediated by their owners, and were able to categorize more or less what state they were in. And we came up with a very simple, maybe oversimplified 3-category system where we quickly could put it into the good category, regular or bad. Good means that, you know, it's sort of like a do-it-yourself. It's an issue of just aesthetics, fixing, cleaning up, you know, abandoned cars and painting and scraping paint and things of the sort. Regular, we're already talking about you need a jack of all trades or a handyman, handywoman type figure to come help you put in windows, doors, minor repairs. And bad, we're already talking about you need a contractor. Maybe there's even structural damages that need to be removed and so on. We did see a correlation between the bad category with those coastal areas and those areas that were hit hard by hurricanes. Nevertheless, we can say that more than half of the properties are in a condition where they can be rehabbed, and they can be rehabbed for a cost-effective amount as well. Next slide. So how does the CRH assist local governments? And again, you know, I highlight our partnership with La Liga. We do have a number of Liga partners who came to us through our work with other Liga partners and vice versa. We start off by doing community mapping efforts. We go into communities, and for the first time ever, we actually put together a census of where all these vacant abandoned properties are, and start correlating it with other data. Where are the, you know, main corridors? Where are the commercial areas? Where are the pockets of poverty? Where are the risk areas, flood zones, and things of the sort, so we can have a better idea of what we can do with that asset map. Next slide. This here is an example of one municipality. This is actually a Liga member. This is the municipality of Hormigueros, and we were able to, that was the first municipality that we mapped entirely. And you can see different concentrations within the urban centers, some suburbs, and even some rural properties where we were able to identify properties that the city could acquire through a number of different legal tools, such as tax foreclosures and nuisance forfeiture and other mechanisms that we help cities establish so that they could recapture a lot of these properties. Next slide. Another thing we do is we help cities filter through which properties have owners, who are the owners, whether or not the owners can appear and, you know, mitigate their property. We most code enforcement programs are punitive, and most of them unfortunately disproportionately hurt low-income communities. Nevertheless, we carry out code enforcement programs in collaboration with our cities, utilizing some very basic participatory concepts. We are very transparent. We meet with community members before we start mapping. They accompany us to the field so they can point out which properties might be problem properties for the neighborhood. And here's a picture of one community meeting where we are placing the profiles of the properties that we already inventoried, and we're receiving feedback from community leaders and residents. And it makes for a very transparent program where people trust in the local government, where the case files that we lift have already sort of been vetted through the wisdom and knowledge of residents who've lived there for decades. And I always joke about how I can get an engineer or a lawyer to put together a really great nuisance abatement report and charge me $200 an hour. but it's the neighbor who knows that that property is owned by the son of the drugstore who lives in New York, and here's his Facebook. So we do leverage that community knowledge, and they also bring to us very sensitive cases. This property is a person who had to be displaced because of cancer treatment and so on. So since then, they left the property. We can move on to the next. So this code enforcement process, approximately 44% of these properties are fixed by their owner. The owners do appear, they voluntarily fix the property, and that we consider sort of like our frontline victory. We get all sorts of great results. You start seeing 4 out of every 10 properties within a neighborhood getting painted. People, renting the property that hasn't been rented for quite some time. You start seeing them take away old abandoned cars, pick up trash and things of the sort. But it leaves us with another 56% of the properties that are never claimed. Property owners do not show up. They either passed away, they don't exist, or they have no interest. And that's where the CRH assists these cities through their code enforcement programs, filter through the property, and feed in what we call the pipeline viable vacant abandoned properties. And again, our goal always is try to get the owners, track them down, and try to get them voluntary, fix the properties. If every owner appeared and fixed their property, that would be amazing, problem solved. But for the cases where they do not show up, then we try to look at those properties as an opportunity for a future placemaking effort or a future housing opportunity, things of the sort. Next slide, please. So then the question is, what do we do with all these vacant abandoned properties in Puerto Rico? Again, there are a lot that might just need to be demolished so we can restore coastal areas, or we can, avoid people moving back into at-risk or flood-prone areas. So what do we do with all these properties? And as Thomas is saying, that if you were to just put them all up for sale, you would get these LLCs that would come and buy up 20, 30 of them and so on. And what we've learned through observing other jurisdictions where they use that methodology, the result would be the opposite of what they were looking for. We want to improve the condition of housing. We want to create new affordable housing options for families and so on. So we create community land banks, and we assist city governments create community land banks. They are quasi-public entities that are created by ordinance, but they are ran by community members. And here's a photo of one community meeting, of a community land bank meeting. And it's fascinating about this model is you have representatives from different neighborhoods that are from a very vast base of classes, types, races, genders, everything you can imagine. Very diverse group which runs on the day-to-day the community land bank in this particular municipality. We have 5 land banks in Puerto Rico that are currently incorporated. 4 of them are Liga members, so we're very proud of that, and we do correlate that close relationship with the success of League members who have been able to create community land banks. Next slide, please. So we quickly ran into a number of obstacles when we started building up these land banks. We saw that, on one hand, they could not just sell properties as is on an open market. Families, especially low and middle income families, do not have cash reserves to buy those homes in cash. They don't have the cash reserves to fix those homes. A lot of the times, lending institutions do not have any sort of product that could assist a family purchase a dilapidated home and fix it. And traditional banks and even some credit unions would quickly turn away the land bank when the land bank was trying to find access to capital to fix these properties prior to sale or rent. So, land banks are new organizations. They do not have credit history. They do not have financials. They are quasi-public organizations, but often are started with no or little funding. And a lot of their collateral is dilapidated. So banks quickly turned us away. And we were seeing that the community land banks in Puerto Rico had no way to finance these properties. And the only way for them to sell their properties was as is on an open market and a auction type system. Next slide, please. And we saw that the financial tools that the land bank needed were nowhere to be seen, especially here in Puerto Rico. They needed to have access to flexible funding to cover things such as rehab and transaction costs. Remember, some of these properties do have title issues, and even though land banks do have certain mechanisms they can employ to clear title or clear tax debts, it does have its transaction costs. They need to hire lawyers, appraisals, and eventually contractors to fix these properties. They didn't need traditional balloon loans. They needed revolving lines of credit because the idea was to get these properties out as quick as possible, get them into the land bank, get them in a suitable condition as to where you can dispose of them and move them on or so on. especially within the absence of nonprofit developers and other groups that could quickly take those properties. The land bank was finding itself in a position where they had to develop housing. So unfortunately, we started knocking on all kinds of doors and just would not find any sort of product anywhere. And that's when we started looking at different models elsewhere. And we can jump to the next slide. And that's when we conceptualized the idea of creating the Fondo CRH, or the CRH fund. And next slide. What we wanted to do was create a sort of a revolving fund to help local land banks pool quick capital, fix their properties, replenish that line of credit, just start capitalizing their land banks. With just a handful of properties, 3 or 4 properties, we could, quickly get that land bank in a position where they could start increasing the type of properties or the type of risk that they assume. Obviously, starting with the sweet spot properties, I like to emphasize that in Puerto Rico, there are so many abandoned properties and there is so much housing need and so many families looking for housing that we kind of do have the luxury right now to concentrate on those sweet spot properties. We can filter out our database will show me 10 properties that are not in flood zone, that require very little repair, that are easy to acquire. And especially when you consider the fact that the land bank is getting the bulk of these properties practically for free through nuisance abatement, nuisance forfeiture projects or programs, it does provide a very big, ample space for affordable housing. We're talking about the state is using its power to convert equity, which is right now tied up in tax debt, things of the sort, into a tool for affordable housing when it's handed over to the land bank. So right now, short-term wins, we're working with land banks, creating that revolving line of credit. We signed our first line of credit with the Toa Baja Land Bank. They're going to concentrate on some low-risk properties that are easy to acquire, easy to fix, and aiming primarily towards working class, middle class families as a way for them to build up their portfolio and eventually start branching into other things like more rigorous types of repairs, multi-family housing, and so on. We could jump to the next slide. And just to give you an example of how land bank scaling would work with a tool of this, a city acquires a property, transfers it to the land bank taps into its line of credit, or in this case, the Fondo CRH. Properties are sold, and as the properties are sold, as Tram very well emphasized, they can include all sorts of really great affordable housing conditions or mechanisms to make sure that that affordability is perpetual, that debt balance is repaid, and then they are freeing up their capital for future repairs and just continue to scale up their work. Next slide, please. And of course, those conditions, we've talked about a bunch of different mechanisms, and there are so many different flavors that obviously not, one of them is a one size fits all for every community. You can't work it on a case-by-case basis. We can work ground leases. We've even talked about things like roof leases for future microgrids and solar energy. Talk about land trust, cooperative housing, and other mechanisms to guarantee that long-term affordability. You can even stretch that Fondo CRH to include multifamily housing, even mixed use, or even creative placemaking if need be. That Fondo, the beauty about it is it's so flexible, and since it is for the benefit of community-based land banking, the possibilities are endless. And, again, it's not like we woke up one morning and thought to ourselves, hey, we would love to, just lend money out. Not quite how it happened. We kind of fell into this endeavor out of necessity, and just nobody else was doing it. So we kind of had to create something. But if there is a way for us in the future to leverage our fund dollars and use it, for example, as a guarantee, so that a credit union or a cooperative could triple, quadruple, even quintuple, I don't know if I said that correctly, funding available, then obviously what we want to do is we want to maximize that impact. So our Fondo CRH, we are projecting within the first 3 years a $3 million goal. That gives us an approximate at about $65,000 per properties per home, about 46 homes that can be fixed. Again, we're talking about these properties that are coming into the land bank practically for free from the city. But as the land banks start capitalizing and building their capacity, they could start branching out into more creative projects. Next slide, please. And yeah, that's it. So I think I have 2 minutes, but it was that more or less is in a nutshell how a revolving loan fund in Puerto Rico does plug in to address both the vacancy and the affordable housing issue, kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone.
Thank you so much, Luis, for that presentation. That was a lot, but it was great. And I also want to thank you for coming up with this highly innovative instrument that we need in Puerto Rico. We're very proud as PolicyLink to have been also one of the initial supporters of the Fondo CRH. We recently made an investment in it, and we're very hopeful that others will follow to help this get jump-started. I want to quickly turn to Tony. And Tony, I'd love to get your reflections on what you just heard from our colleagues whose work spans different scales to achieve housing justice. And Grounded Solutions Network, which you lead, also works at different scales and across the United States to advance alternative for lasting affordability and also for community control in the housing space. Now, based on what you heard right now, what caught your attention? What seems promising? What could be done over the next few years to achieve the kind of impact that can actually significantly reshape housing markets? And lastly, is there a role for philanthropy? And you have 5 minutes, but I think it'll bleed into the Q&A. So yeah, looking forward to your reflections, Tony.
Yes, well, first of all, I just want to say how profoundly excited I am to hear all of the panelists talking about their ideas from a constructive standpoint of how to really accomplish the kind of systems change that we need in order to make community ownership and community control of land and assets a much more typical and common occurrence than it is today. I think it's no secret that all of us on this panel, as well as the folks who've joined us today, we all understand the continuing expansion of the twin racial wealth and homeownership gaps. It is really the result of existing systems and policies that were planned. And so when it was mentioned earlier that they're operating just the way they were intended, that's the actual truth. And so really, we have to be very intentional about changing those systems and policies to create meaningful benefits, especially for communities of color. And I really am excited to hear everyone who's focused on community-driven interventions, talking about tenant opportunity to purchase policies, land banking, CLTs like Africatown and Oak CLT, which are members of my own network, going beyond those into other forms of community ownership with cooperatives. We have embraced resident-owned communities and manufactured housing as part of this new evolving ecosystem that we need to put in place to really control assets for the benefit of communities. And also hearing about the role of data and policy advocacy, elevating those. They're linked. We've certainly worked at the national level to collect data on the performance of shared equity and community land trust programs and policies, as well as using that to advocate at the local, state, and federal level for the kind of policy change that's needed. And I will just say, I think the call to action for philanthropy is really to support the expansion of community ownership at scale with transformative investments at the below market financing cost that's needed in order to create the kind of system change that we're looking for. And they have not only financial resources at philanthropy's disposal, but they also have influence and power of their own to actually exert upon the traditional financial sector to make conditions more conducive to the kind of needs that we have. I think Luis and his work in Puerto Rico is really exemplifying this lack really in the traditional financing sector of understanding of what the products and needs are to really have this larger scale application of land banking and the community ownership approaches that we're advocating for. I also think it's philanthropy's responsibility to help promote narrative change. Just as Rashida shared with the Spatial Futures Initiative, we really need to shift this emphasis on individual wealth creation to more what is the larger communal benefit of taking control of assets, real estate, housing in particular, rather than leaving it to profit-motivated market entities who are not serving vast segments of the population. I also want to share that we've done some work on the linkage of community ownership and shared equity to climate resilience. The Georgetown Climate Center actually produced a paper with case study examples for not just US-based community land trust and shared equity programs, but some international examples as well. I put a link to that in the chat if anybody is interested in exploring some of that. And there were some conclusions that come out of that. Back to this role of data and research to inform the policy advocacy. We're not so innovative that we're doing things that have never been done before. They've been done and they've been successfully done. And it's time to really elevate the fact that there's less risk associated with this than many people likely perceive. And that's not just decision makers within the traditional housing, finance, and policy sector. That's actually sometimes community residents on the ground who are not getting accurate information about what these programs and policies can actually do and achieve on their behalf with sufficient understanding of how they operate. I will just kind of finish it out according to my reflections by saying we're starting to see glimmers of hope around the philanthropic sector's embrace of this. It started with our own organization, along with about 10 other organizations within our network receiving unrestricted gifts from Mackenzie Scott. Certainly that's the best and highest aspiration of organizations really getting, a windfall of unrestricted funding that we can direct as we see as needed, without having to go through the burden of reporting on the impact of that money, but actually just being able to do the work and demonstrate what the impact of it is with the actions that we take. I'm also seeing Amazon, believe it or not, investing $3.2 billion in a housing equity fund that is partially supporting 99-year affordability in the rental space and shared equity homeownership via community land trusts in 3 major markets in the United States. If we treat that as a pilot and we can actually learn some lessons from the deployment of $3.2 billion, I have to say it again with a B, that could have influence on other philanthropic organizations and institutions to make similar types of investments. And that's the kind of scale that we need to see philanthropy operating at, with the depth of the crisis that we know that exists, especially for communities of color. So I'll stop there with my sort of glimmer of hope message about that, and turn it over to you, Deepak, to kind of lead us into the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Tony, for those reflections. Before we turn to Q&A and we turn off the recording, I want to thank Magic Cabinet for their partnership. Thank you to the partners and colleagues for your work. Thank you to the panelists for agreeing to share these amazing insights and information with us. And thank you to the attendees for joining us.